When I think back to a few years ago and what I thought the adoption process would be like and compare it to what I'm starting to find it's actually like as I'm seriously getting into it, I'm reminded of the ways in which our conception doesn't always line up with the reality of situations. I also think a bit about some of my friends who have started hesitantly asking questions, trying to understand what this process is like. And I'm reminded from years of teaching that when one person asks a question, it's very common that other people have the same question as well. Something else I've learned from teaching is that if you really want to learn how something works, one of the best ways to do that is to teach about it. So while I'm preparing for today's episode, I'm perhaps becoming aware of just how much I don't know. My aim for this episode is to distill some answers out to some of those questions that people might be wondering and to hopefully demystify some of the mystery related to adoption and fostering. Welcome to episode 3 of Volunteer Parenting. When I teach Introduction to Sociology, I have a unit called What Makes a Family, and in that unit I talk briefly about how children come into our lives. There are really 3 key ways that children come into our lives. One of those is through sexual activity that leads to reproduction, another of those is through adoption, and another is through assisted reproductive technologies. So, adoption, let's hone in on that part. What exactly does that look like? Well, there's a few different forms even that can take. We might consider, for example, private adoption. Private adoption is effectively where birth parents and adoptive parents work out an arrangement between them, usually facilitated by lawyers. And most commonly this would be around the birth of a child. So say a woman has a baby that she doesn't want to keep, and she might work out some kind of private adoption so that someone else who's interested in parenting gets the custody rights to that child. This isn't exactly the system that I'm working with. I am working with the system that is connected with the foster care system. And so how exactly does foster care and adoption through foster care work? Well, the foster care system is the system set up and run largely by the state for taking care of children who have been removed from the home for some reason. There are a variety of reasons that children might be removed from the home. One of the most common is what's referred to as child maltreatment. Maltreatment is a broad category that refers to several things, including abuse and neglect. By one statistic I came across, 61% of children in the foster care system are there because of child neglect. That basically they weren't being cared for appropriately, and the state was forced to remove them from their home. But of course there are other reasons that children might be removed from the home and placed in foster care. Another relatively common reason has to do with substance abuse by their parents, so using illicit drugs. Another reason might have to do with parents being incarcerated. Obviously, if you're in prison, you can't care for your children. There might be a significant illness or perhaps even death that results in a child needing other care. And in some cases, children might be kicked out of the home for all sorts of reasons. Perhaps they do something that their parents disapprove of, and their parents kick them out, or they run away. So there are a variety of different reasons that children might be removed from their birth families and need to be placed into foster care. So when a child is removed from the birth family, for whatever reason, the first priority typically is to try to find some other family member to take them in. This is referred to as kin, taking other kin that will take the children. If children being removed from the home can't be placed with extended family members, the next attempt is to put them with a foster home. So another family or another adult who's not related to the child but has been approved as a foster parent. And if foster parents aren't available, then children may end up being placed in some kind of a group home. Now, foster care is meant to be a temporary situation. Typically, because of the ways in which we understand family, the primary goal in most cases is to attempt to eventually return the child to the birth family, assuming that's possible. And typically there is a plan put into place that birth parents are supposed to follow, and if they can meet the goals of that plan, and usually with other kinds of requirements as appropriate, the children eventually, ideally, are returned to their birth families. Now, caseworkers typically attempt to minimize the number of moves that a child has to make because each move is very disruptive and, as you might imagine, fairly traumatic for most children. But the longer a child spends in the foster care system, the more likely they may need to be moved from one place to another. It's also possible that some children may end up cycling in and out of the foster care system. So they may be in foster care for a time, their parents do whatever is needed related to their plan, and so they're returned to their parents, but then something happens where they get back into foster care again. In fact, roughly 400,000 children currently are in the foster care system in some capacity. And roughly a quarter of those, or about 100,000 children, are what is referred to as available for adoption, and I'll explain more on that in a moment. Of those 400,000 children, the ages range everywhere from infancy all the way up to 18. In fact, about 175,000 children are between the ages of 10 and 18. So we can see just from that brief snapshot, there's a wide spread of ages of children in the foster care system. Each year, approximately 36,000 children leave the foster care system to be placed with a family member. Another 50,000 children are adopted out of that system. Note that that's only about half of the 100,000 that are available for adoption. And approximately 26,000 children age out of the foster care system, meaning they reach the age of 18, or in some cases a little bit older, up to possibly 21, and they are no longer part of the foster care system. As you might imagine, aging out of the system can be a fairly difficult thing because typically these are children who don't have significant social resources, such as other family members, to be able to draw upon for support in transitioning into adulthood. In very rare cases, birth parents may intentionally place their children for adoption, but the much more common reason that children in foster care end up being adopted or being placed for adoption is because they simply can't return to their birth families. And there are multiple reasons this may happen. One common one is that the birth parents don't meet their case plan. This may also be coupled with a recognition that returning the child to the birth family is simply not a safe option for the child. In such a case, the birth parents' rights are legally severed, and then the child is available for adoption. Typically, when a child is available for adoption, the first priority, or at least the first preference, is given to the foster home that they are currently in. However, they may not. They may not, for whatever reason, want to adopt the child. And this means that the child could end up staying in foster care, available for adoption, but still in the foster care system for potentially an extended period. This is part of the reason that 26,000 children each year age out of the foster care system. So let's think for a moment about these children who age out of foster care. I mean, 26,000 children each year is a lot. That is more than double the student body of the university I currently teach at. That's a lot of people each year. Why does this happen? I remember as I started this process, both of the social workers that I spoke with as I was initially submitting my inquiry about becoming a foster parent asked me what age of child I was interested in. And when I said, well, I'm interested in an older child, definitely no younger than 8 years old, both of them said a variation on, oh, well, that's good, because if you had wanted a baby, then the wait period would be very long. Why? Well, why is there such a mismatch between the desire for babies, but the lack of availability of babies, and really the need to take in older children? Part of it may have to do with the way in which most typical families begin. As noted, there are 3 primary ways that children come into our lives, and the most common of those is sexual activity that leads to reproduction. If that's the route you take, well, you're going to start with a baby. I think some of this may also have to do with many people wanting to be the primary influence on a child and believing that an older child, they've already developed a good bit, they've already taken on many aspects of personality through their various experiences in life. I sometimes wonder if there might also be a perception of older children as supposedly damaged goods, which again I think is a really problematic way to put it. It does sort of recognize the reality that many of these children, particularly older children, have likely been through some level of trauma and through some potentially very negative experiences. In some senses, I think that actually means that they're more in need of a loving and stable home, that it's actually more important to be able to find homes for these children. So, of course, all of this is conjecture. I don't know definitively if this is true. It's not like I've done any kind of systematic studies on it, but we can definitively state that we have a greater preference on the whole for babies and younger children, but the greater need typically is for older children. So, what does all of this look like from the parents' end of things? Well, parents who enter into the system can engage in a few different ways. They can be foster parents, or they could be adoptive parents, or they could end up playing both roles. Some parents or some people get into this simply to foster. They do not want to have a permanent placement through adoption, but they are intentionally fostering. Some get into it because they are ultimately looking to adopt and are not really interested in fostering, and some are interested in both or are working through the transition between the two, that they are what we might call fostering to adopt. Even with those who foster, there are a few different divisions we might think about. Some parents go in as what are called respite parents, so they intentionally take children only for very short periods of time, so it might be something like an emergency placement situation, or where a longer-term foster parent has a reason they need to send the child away for a few days. Maybe they're, say, going out of the country for a bit and can't take their child with them, or something along those lines. So there are a lot of different ways that people might interface with this system. Even for parents who are interested ultimately in adopting, there's a few different ways that might happen. They could start out as foster parents, and then if that child that they are fostering becomes available for adoption, as noted before, they typically have first priority in putting in an application to adopt the child. Even if they are intentionally seeking out children who are already available for adoption, typically that child is going to have to live with them in a foster care arrangement for at least 6 months before the final legal paperwork can be put through to finalize that adoption, and in some cases even longer than 6 months. I've also had people asking me questions like, how much does this cost? Do you get paid? How much say do you have in the kinds of children that you take in? And those are all really interesting questions. The answer to some degree depends on how you go about doing the foster care system itself. I am working through the public system, through the state of Tennessee directly, so I'm expecting it will be costing little to nothing. And everything I've read indicates that the few things that I may have to pay primarily would be reimbursed or are reimbursable if I keep receipts. If I were to have gone through a private adoption agency, I would probably expect to spend somewhere in the range of a few $1,000s. A lot of that would be for legal fees, but there might be a few other components as well. And of course, if you go through international adoption, which is actually an entirely different system, you're not working with the foster care system, that can be on the order of $30,000, $60,000. It can be a lot of money. Those working through the public system, there is a I forget exactly how they call it, but effectively there is a reimbursement payment for basic living expenses for any children you take in. In the state of Tennessee, it looks like that is right around $25 per day for a child that you take in. So that means that if you have a child for a month, you can expect to be getting roughly $750. But that money is meant to go towards reimbursement of basic living expenses. It's a per diem rate for things like food, clothing, school supplies, basic kind of necessity items. If a child that I eventually adopt, then they are completely my responsibilities. On the question of how much say do I get in the kind of child that I might take in, it's actually kind of amazing how much input prospective parents seem to get. to some degree, as I understand it, I could specify things like age of the child's gender, even the child's race, and though some of this at first glance may seem a little bit weird, being able to have some input in things like this, some of this is also about finding compatible living arrangements and something that will work well for the child. You don't want to end up putting a child in a situation where they're not comfortable or they are dealing with extra stressors in their life. And so this would also include other things like trying to find arrangements that fit with my own lifestyle and my own kind of way of living and what works for my particular living situation. And that's going to be true for a variety of different prospective parents, that you want to make sure that you have really a good match between what the parent has to offer and how the parent lives their life and what the child needs, and that those two things can be bridged together in a way that works for the best interest of the child. So it's actually good in many ways to have a variety of different parent types and family arrangements to work with, because it gives perhaps more flexibility for children coming into different kinds of situations with different kinds of needs they may face. And if you happen to know something else about this, and I seem to be in error, please let me know, because a lot of this is still very new to me, and there are some details that have been a little bit difficult to figure out, and so I would be very happy to have more accurate information. So if you have corrections to make, please let me know. I really love things that have double meanings to them, and volunteer parenting is definitely something with a double meaning. So on the one hand, this is a reference to my home state, Tennessee. Tennessee is known as the volunteer state. So there's a way in which I'm paying homage to that particular reality about my home state of Tennessee. But there's another way in which this is actually very descriptive of the process I'm embarking on as I understand it. Adoption is very much an intentional act. It is an intentional form of parenting. There's no way that one just accidentally falls into adoption. Oops, we've adopted. That doesn't happen. So in some senses, the idea of volunteer parenting is recognizing that moving into a foster and adoptive framework is being very intentional about adopting. In some senses, then, volunteer parenting is about recognizing that moving into a foster and adoptive framework is a very intentional form of parenting. Perhaps even more so because of the fact that I am male and single. So there's really no way that I could accidentally become a parent. It is very voluntary and very intentional. I suppose you could say I really have two goals for this vlog. One of those is to document my own process as a single gay man in Tennessee becoming an adoptive parent. But on some level, I'm also hoping that this might be helpful for others who are similarly situated in their own parenting quest. I know it's been really helpful for me watching other videos of people who are documenting their own experiences, particularly along some of the less common experiences, so people who are adopting as single parents or who are adopting older children or things of that nature. But of course, that's a lot of different axes to all tie together into one. And I'm documenting this partly because I think it's interesting to be able to add that story, but also because I hope that others are finding it helpful in some way. Of course, that also means if you have any particular questions or things that you want me to cover, I am more than happy to entertain that. There's a lot else out there, and I want this to be of interest to those who are viewing. So if you have questions or ideas, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I will see what I can do about that. Guarnatee has been tolerated me making